it goes down to, like, one of the buildings that was one of the hotter buildings where it ran one fan. So that there was one fan, so that when they had it on, it could cool this one building, like, at the end of the line. It ran. We'll get to your vacation in a little bit, your trip to the West Coast. But right now I wanted to talk to you about me going to the lower eastern coast. I was still on the East Coast, so there's that. I went over to the Berkshires. I don't know
where that is.
It's a magical place in western Massachusetts. Western Massachusetts, close to where Connecticut is. If you have Connecticut below you and you have New York over to the west, it's that corner of Massachusetts. It's a very artistic section of the state, which is the reason why a lot of the things that you go to see was like the Herman Melville house for Arrowhead, because he wrote Moby Dick there. It's where Edith Wharton had a studio there. It's where a lot of artists, a lot of writers, worked there. But one of the cool things that they have is something called Hancock Shaker Village, and we have Shaker Villages up here too. Hancock was one of the larger facilities that they had, and we went there. We went there last year, but we went there this year as well, and. Something that I think is really fascinating about it, which is what I really wanted to talk about today, is the idea of, like, technology that we take for granted today.
Or, like, predating Industrial Revolution stuff?
Yeah. Stuff that, like, came in before the advent of, like, industrialization and electricity and all of that, which kind of makes sense considering that a lot of what we talk about are like fantasy games and stuff like that, which is also usually pre-industrial and before that era of electric.
Yeah, most fantasy doesn't really have much in the way of industrialization.
No, but they still have to do things. And
sometimes, but they also have magic.
They also have magic, which is very helpful. But I don't know, sometimes... Isn't magic just technology that you don't understand?
Okay, thanks for quoting Marvel.
Anyway, so a couple of things that they did that was very interesting, at least at Hancock Shaker Village, is that they had a whole round barn that they used for feeding their dairy cattle, where they would pitch all of the hay into the top of this giant cylinder that has a big steam stack in the middle to let out all of the steam from the hay, and then lead the cows around the exterior, pitch the hay right in front of their face, secure the cows there, and then milk them while they're eating the hay from the round bin, and then lead them back out. A lot of work to get there, because it's just this giant stone structure that they had to build in order to make that happen. But then the other thing that is always fun is that you get to go and watch the water turbine demonstration, where they will turn on this big industrial water turbine. The way that this works, this is before electric came in, this was something that they did in the late 1800s, early 1900s, is they would have these mountain springs that were up in the hills, and they piped down through continually smaller and smaller pipes down to this water turbine, so that the pressurized water would go through the turbine and could create about a 3 horsepower engine that they were able to use to power a lot of the machinery. And so what happens is that it comes through, there's these giant belts that they attach to the water turbines, and then those belts get moved over so that you can run your saws, your lathe, your machinery there. And then on some days, when they would do the washing, which is right next door, they could use it for the washing machines as well, like the ones where they would actually scrub and agitate the clothing on laundry day. Past that, because they didn't want to waste anything, is those would then go off to the irrigation for the fields for their crops, And then the wastewater, after it went through the irrigation, would go to create a swamp that was in the back where they would grow black ash trees, which they would use for basket weaving. So there was like this whole thing that they would use, industrial.
So just systematically, from start to finish, they had things going on.
You had things that you would use that water for, from the actual machinery itself to doing the agriculture to doing the, essentially the other kind of agriculture that you would use in the swamp. And so they would utilize that whole thing all the way down. This is fairly advanced for what you consider the time period to be, which was like colonial America. But it's fascinating that they had this working, and they had it working very well. I had asked last year for the guy that was giving the demonstration, like, how long could you actually run this for? If you were draining the entire cisterns, like the entire reservoirs at the top, and he was like, oh, you could run it continuously for like 7-8 hours or something like that at that kind of pressure. It's just,
wow.
Yeah, you could run it a long time. They usually didn't, but that you could run it continuously, if you had a full reservoir or something like that. Pretty impressive. And then, of course, by like the 30s or something, they end up abandoning all of that because electricity comes in, so they start using electric.
And water power is something that we as humans have been kind of using for like thousands of years now. So it's not something we're really a stranger to.
Right. Creating like an actual hydro engine out of it was very new technology at the time.
Kind of, but not really. Like, it's the same concept as running like a water wheel.
Water wheels? Yeah, because I do think about
up.
water wheels, yeah.
Because like a water wheel just uses the current of the river to spin the wheel to then turn gears to move other things.
Right.
Same concept. I think this is just a higher torque, probably.
Yeah. In order to create like an actual like engine that would be able to run machinery like that at the speed it had to run it at. Yeah.
And I mean, again, it's pretty easy, I think, to take like water power and use it for these things. Not necessarily easy in the way that like, oh, this isn't complicated, just easy to be able to go, yeah, we're going to harness this river, we're going to hook it up to a wheel that spins, that turns gears, and you got your ratios right on the gears, so that even a little bit of power turns into a lot of bit of power, because that's just how gear ratios can do things.
Yeah, I kept thinking about this, is the idea, if you have a water wheel and you have a big enough gear that's set onto the back of it, and you put it to a small enough gear, I'm thinking that you could get that to be running pretty fast. Like, by the time from the ratio. You just have to kind of know the you just have to know the proportions so that you can get to the right RPM in order to make that work. But I think the other thing, though, that was really important about like the water turbine is the consistency, because when they open that up, they have that consistent power that's going through. Water wheels were kind of dependent on how fast the river was running and how consistently so they were kind of...
I mean, yeah, it's a little bit more finicky, but you can always like... You could, for instance, make a dam that leads a spillway into a water wheel as well.
Which is sort of what they ended up doing, yeah.
Right.
Sort of that.
Because same thing as like hydroelectric dams. They dam up the water source and then they let the water go in. The same thing. That is the same exact concept as a water turbine.
Sure.
In fact, that is just a more advanced water turbine, I'm pretty sure.
Hydroelectric dam, yeah, that's pretty much the same idea too,
Yeah, water power is super, like... all natural and efficient, so
Yeah, and being able to use it for multiple things is a really cool thing to do. Anyway, to get kind of back to what the reason I'm talking about all of this is...
Oh, good, we get a reason.
Yeah, like I mentioned at the beginning, is when we're talking about these fantasy worlds, we have things that we think about doing today, and I like thinking about the idea of having to do those things pre-industry, pre the time period where we have, electric switches that we can turn on, where you had generators and all of this technology that we have today, that you still have to figure out ways to do it. And how do you power that? And how do you actually make the cities run in these worlds? And that one of the easiest ways to do it is to look at what towns and cities were doing in the past and take some of the more futuristic technologies that they would have seen at the time, the more advanced stuff, and see how you could apply them into those cities to figure out the ins and outs of how these civilizations run in your world.
Side question, what did they use for light sources there?
Well, that was mostly just candles. Most of what they did was just to make candles. Although, here's something that I think is kind of interesting. With that water turbine, because it was the one thing that they had that was like an engine, that also ran to other buildings that were under, like, that were underneath, so that it could go off to, like, the woodworking shop and all of that. It goes down to, like, one of the buildings that was one of the hotter buildings where it ran one fan. So that there was one fan, so that when they had it on, it could cool this one building, like, at the end of the line. It ran this one fan.
That's pretty great.
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of, I think, maybe, like, I don't know, remember what it was some video I watched. And it was about torches.
Yes.
And lighting up dungeons, for instance, in D&D.
Oh, yeah.
And they're always lit by torches. And the video was going on, this doesn't make sense, that's not what they would have done. You wouldn't have somebody lighting a torch and then keeping them on throughout the thing. Torches would be not very viable. They'd last X amount of time, and then you have to relight a torch, make a new torch, because they burn out. It's like, what you would actually have in these situations is like oil lantern type deals.
Yeah, exactly.
Oil or gas lights, for instance, where you'd fill the oil up, it would burn slowly and keep a low light, but it would light. But it would keep this place lit. You wouldn't want some, little servant running around a castle with an open flame, trying to light all the fucking torches.
No, that would be a bad idea. So,
and can you think of all the smoke damage and like problems that would cause too?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, when we were looking at like some of the council chambers and stuff for the Shakers, what they would have had were essentially like chandeliers, but they were made for like candles, so that you could put like individual candles in like a larger instrument, so that it would throw off more light at night. And then of course a lot of their buildings were kind of like open concept, or they had like just a lot of windows, so they would have a lot of natural light coming in throughout the day to help with that too. But
yeah, it's always interesting. Like, I've thought of things for like settlement building in like RPGs, for instance.
Sure.
And how to do that in a way that would make sense, you'd have to do it more akin to that type of stuff, like how the Amish do it, how the Shakers probably do it.
Yep.
You'd be building frames of buildings, and then having to set up sawmills and having to set up different parts of a colony, like how you would have originally had to do it when you settled somewhere new, because you can only bring so many supplies.
Right.
So it's like, all right, the first order of business is setting up a dock and setting up like a sawmill and then like a mess hall. Like a big house for people to sleep in. And then it's like, from there, it's like you can start building out, but like you get your first things in.
Yeah.
With the supplies you have. And I think a lot of the times you would end up taking apart like one of the boats that you came in on too.
Oh yeah, because you could reuse the wood. Yeah.
Like if you're not planning to go anywhere, you leave the transport and you take another boat and take it apart and use that, or just upend the hull, turn that into a building itself.
Yeah. The round building too, which is the one that for the cattle, is they had built this specifically so that they had like a ramp where they could have, your trays for all of the hay that they collected in the field, so that they didn't have to like put them in individually to this giant building, so that they had a ramp so that they could just take that entire thing of hay and drop it down into the center of this building, and then built this giant column that was in the middle that vented up, so that you didn't end up with all of the steam coming out into the building, that it vented up out into the middle. And they built this whole thing specifically so that you didn't have to do all of that labor of like pitching the individual hay into this one small space, so that you could keep it all into the center, which is again it seems like a lot of work, but it probably saved him a lot of time at the
Oh
end.
yeah,
So
definitely.
because also, hey, you have to remember, another one of those things is that you can't really let it stay out and get wet for long periods of time. Once you get it, you have to pretty much find a way to preserve it so that it doesn't get mold or anything or spoil. And so they had to take it all out of the field, and they had to get it into a building as fast as they could.
Right, you
Before,
leave it
yeah.
out to dry, and then you take it right away.
Yeah, you kind of, well, they didn't even really want to wait for it to dry. That's why they built the steam
okay.
stack, because if
fair.
if they keep it out in the field, it's more prone to get, mold and disease and stuff like from that. So they got to get it into a building so that it doesn't get more rain on it, because if it rains while your hay's outside, it's never going to dry out. So you got to
that's fair.
You got to get it into the building as quickly as possible. So they built this specifically for expedience of doing that. But then when new technology comes along, like the little auto milker machines that they had, they didn't have to do hand milking as often, because they were Shakers. I think like Mennonites are similar to this, and I think the Quakers might have been, were ones that, like, when they saw new technologies, they were like, oh, we're gonna find a way to use that. Like, the Amish are not really that way. So they're all very different in how they utilize things. But the Shakers were definitely the one of those civilizations where they were like, ooh, new thing, let's adopt that and do something cool with it. We can make that something.
It's always interesting to see the varying technological levels of that type of stuff.
Yeah.
Because again, like the Amish kind of eschew most electronic type.
Basically everything. Basically everything.
I know.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into like deep Amish lore here or anything, but I know like once you turn to a certain age, you're allowed to like go out and experience the world a bit and decide if you want to come back, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. It's whatever. It's a whole thing, I guess. I don't know if it's fine or not.
Right. Well, and the Shakers were also celibate too, which is probably the reason why. But they would occasionally like adopt children that had like lost their parents or were given up, and then the kids could eventually decide if they wanted to stay or go. So later on, so that's kind of one of those things where you'd see like the kids' rooms that they had built specifically for those purposes, and schoolhouses that they had put together. But
I think it's definitely interesting to look at those because they're modern examples of pre-industrial type stuff.
Sure.
And if you want to set a game in fantasy that deals with pre-industrial type technologies, these are probably the closest thing that you can currently actually look at.
Right.
To do.
Right. We also went over to well, it's pretty much just a walking tour, but it's the Shaker Village that they have over in, I want to say it's New Canaan, New York. And that one is pretty much, that's very dilapidated. You can't go into the buildings there. And they're moving basically the whole collection over to a place in Camden. But you can go around and see what was the remnants of that civilization and those buildings and the gardens and everything like that, which is kind of fascinating. And I think what is really an interesting idea when you're talking about building like a fantasy world is seeing the remnants of those civilizations that came before and how they did things. Because even if you have like a higher level of technology in the fantasy world or even like a postmodern world, like a science fiction-y world, there's something really interesting about like going to your science fiction world and then seeing this ancient civilization, the ruins of an ancient civilization, and what they did and how they built their buildings. That's like
trying to piece that together.
Yeah, that's like Wheel of Time or Shannara Chronicles or something, the post-fantasy ones where you see the remnants of our civilization that they think of as ancient because they're way past that.
See that quite a bit in like sci-fi stuff too.
Yeah. And so I think it's an interesting topic to discuss about like how they did things before we do them. Because there's just stuff that you need to do. You need to be able to, feed your population. You need to be able to house and clothe them. You need to have some source of power so that you can run stuff. and, do things more efficiently. You have to have transportation. It's just these things that you're going to have to do in order to create some kind of a civilization. And they didn't have the technology level back then to do that, but they had to still figure it out. So I think it's worthwhile.
Did, so.
Oh yeah, they absolutely did. Many civilizations did. We're talking about, I'm talking about Shaker Village, which is fairly modern. It's in the last couple hundred years. But you want to go back way further. There's ancient civilizations that figured out how to do stuff similarly, with what they had available to them too.
That's when you talk about things like Roman roads.
Roman roads and Mayan ziggurats, and
yeah. The ziggurats are fine, but Roman roads, for instance, for transportation.
Oh, for transportation, yeah, and the aqueducts. And stuff
because
they
were, the roads were just simply, really well done.
Oh yeah.
And they made them as straight as freaking possible.
Oh yeah.
And it was a whole engineering feat itself. So.
That's true. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that you could take from ancient civilizations and how they did things. If you have examples of that, though, please let me know in the comments down below.
Sure, there's tons of videos on YouTube about it.
But something to think about when you're building your world is what kind of came before, and how you actually do the basics, which I think gets lost in the whole big adventuring thing, but it's kind of important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, most RPGs don't go into building societies, civilizations, cities, and stuff like that as much as some video games do.
This would be a world-building exercise that we would be talking about. Yeah. I need to know how you get your grain from point A to point B. It might not be fascinating for the characters, but it would be good for you to know if
logistics.
It comes up. If it's logistics, yeah. This is a logistics podcast now. We're figuring out how to make him. And truthfully, if you do live in a fantasy world and dragons have existed since antiquity, chances are they tried to do something with that. They used the resources available to them that are not realistic to our world, and they used those in order to build something fantastic.
Pretty much.
It's magic. In a world where you can cast fireball, who needs lanterns?
People who want to see, not just blow things up with fireballs.
That's not fun.
I know. You asked.
It's true. If you have some good examples of how you could implement interesting fantasy technology into your game, please let us know in the comments down below. Put your thinking caps on. What do you want to create in your world?